We're using different visual cues these days. So thank you for joining us. My name is Janet Chung, and I am the Advocacy Director with Columbia Legal Services. Appreciate you all joining us today to talk about this new work that we are doing around the COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone's been reeling in this new strange world, and when it comes to addressing this public health crisis, we are only as safe as the most vulnerable. And among the most vulnerable people are the people who are confined by correctional institutions. They're already isolated from their support systems and they lack adequate health care even in the best of times. Today, we're going to introduce you to some community activists and organizations around the state who've been listening to people who are incarcerated. And they've been calling on state leaders to take action to slow the spread within this vulnerable population and in the communities where prisons are located. We're going to start today by hearing from some community members, and then we'll hear from two lawyers at Columbia Legal Services about the lawsuit that we are filing today against Governor Inslee and Secretary Sinclair of the Department of Corrections. I'll introduce each person briefly and ask them to keep their comments to about a minute, and I'll introduce them right before they speak. So some ground rules for folks who are from the media. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please type it into the chat. Everyone has been muted, so we ask that just the people who are the panelists today will be showing their video. So we'll be monitoring the chat, and I'll be directing questions after the panel speaks. So again, welcome to those of you just joining us. We'll hear first from from Nikita Oliver. Nikita Oliver is a community organizer, attorney, and co-executive director of Creative Justice. Welcome, Nikita.
Thank you. So thank you for being here today and taking the time to hear about our concerns. I'm a community organizer and attorney here in Seattle King County. I think it's important for us to lay the context for why this is important. Before COVID-19, there was already an utter lack of health care for community generally, but especially within prisons. We are currently in a global pandemic, which is both a public health and public safety threat to us all. And people inside of prisons are incredibly vulnerable, if not some of the most vulnerable in our communities. Prisons pose an inevitable outbreak spot with 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States, which is more than any other nation state in the world. There are 37,000 people in Washington state behind bars, which includes prisons, jails, immigration detention centers, and juvenile detention facilities as well. There are 20,000 people in state prisons. What is also significant about this number, and it is a fact I think most of us know, is that it is incredibly racially disproportionate. There are about 6 times more Black folks incarcerated in the state of Washington than white, 3 times Native or Alaskan Native, and double that of Latinx folks. What is also significant about the time that we're in is we don't really know how this virus works yet. Scientists are still trying to figure that out. We don't know if you can be reinfected once you've been infected. We don't know what happens to a person who becomes extremely sick and recovers. Do they experience lifelong damage to their lungs or their immune system? And so by subjecting people within the carceral system to this, we may be subjecting them to lifelong consequences of illnesses, but also subjecting them to possible death, which in my opinion is cruel and unusual punishment. Prisons are intentionally an opaque setup. There's a lack of transparency about procedures when we're in quote unquote normal times, and there's continued lack of transparency now about procedures and how things are working in the prison system during this global pandemic. We know that in normal times prisons are crowded, they are unsanitary, and they are often unsafe. Even in the best of times in our society. And now in the midst of a global pandemic, it is my opinion as an activist and abolitionist that prisons are an unacceptable place to subject people to. The prison system is also not equipped to handle an outbreak, and neither are the communities that prisons are located in. We have corrections officers coming in and out from community, and there's a lot of shuffling of incarcerated peoples, and with a lack of health care in these facilities, we are subjecting people to an unhealthy and unacceptable setting. Reality is, once COVID-19 is inside of the prison system, we are subjecting incarcerated peoples and the folks that work in those systems and the communities that those prisons are in to an illness. Prisons are full of folks that are aging, folks that come from already marginalized communities, and what we are looking at is a nightmare. So it is the opinion of many community advocates, activists, and abolitionists that the right thing to do right now is to release people and to take a holistic approach to supporting people and communities post-incarceration.
Thank you, Nikita. Next, we'll hear from Cassandra Butler, who is a sponsor for the Black Prisoners Caucus and a Village of Hope member, works also with the Undoing Institutional Racism Collaborative, and is a family member.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm speaking today more as a family member than anything else. What I want to talk to you briefly about is just the ways in which the Department of Corrections is isolating incarcerated individuals in this pandemic. As a family member, I am deeply concerned for the safety of my family member that's incarcerated, and for this reason would appreciate the same level of contact that I'm able to have with that person on a regular basis. Unfortunately, DOC's response to this pandemic has been modified lockdowns, complete lockdowns of entire institutions. And in this case, I am not able to receive phone calls. My loved one is having to choose between calling our parents who are in a vulnerable age range, to calling his own children, to calling me, to calling his partner. It's kind of a one-shot deal each day in order to ensure that we're all safe and that he's safe. And this to me is just unacceptable. It's not a proper response. Their response inside is not stopping the transport of incarcerated persons who are infected with this virus from institution to institution. They're putting the health at risk of our loved ones that are inside, and then cutting off contact, not allowing us to be able to even check on safety. So this is the biggest problem for me as a family member. I'm a community advocate as well, but you know, it causes me distress every single day to not just know that he's okay, to not even be able, I mean, JPay is so overwhelmed. The GTL phone is so overwhelmed, even with them being limited to sometimes only one phone call a day. He's only being allowed out of his cell 1 hour, 50 minutes to an hour each day, which is a punitive consequence. It's a consequence that you receive when you get in trouble. We shouldn't be assigning punitive consequences during a pandemic. They did nothing wrong. So to lock people away and cut them off from everything, including just being able to check on safety and security, to me is just an unacceptable response. So I thank everybody for allowing me this time. I hope that you all really hear everything that's being said today and really understand that incarcerated individuals are people. They're people just like the rest of us, and they don't deserve to be treated any differently than the rest of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra. We'll go next to Suzanne Cook, who is with the Statewide Family Council.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
My name is Suzanne Cook. I am the wife of a prisoner who is 62 years old and entering his 28th year of incarceration. He has every chronic prison illness possible: heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, and for the past 8 years has survived an unknown life-threatening condition. The COVID virus has really catapulted his survival rate into, I'd say, an abyss. He is one of many older, sick, and compromised prisoners who really now face a fate not of their making. How are these prisoners going to care for themselves in a lockdown with the daily reduction in staff, which we see is happening exponentially? Lockdowns that will limit access for them, as Cassandra spoke about the phones and the ability to reach us outside. Basic medical needs that are unfulfilled in a place that is really already dangerously overloaded. I'm really scared that the imagination and vision of DOC and the governor's office is abundantly scarce, and that the prisoners best suited for release will unnecessarily continue to suffer and potentially die. Historically, families have been walking House and Senate bills through the legislative sessions year after year, testifying in support of the very ideas this lawsuit has laid out. We already have the understanding and knowledge that the carceral state of Washington prisons is in dire need of decarceration. It is busting at the seams, and there are obvious ways to remedy this. Instead of building a 13th prison at Maple Lane, the efforts of our courts, lawmakers, DOC, and the governor's office should be diligently looking for ways to reduce the population of a bloated system, not maintain and grow it. That's one reason why a criminal sentencing task force was created by the legislature to identify and drastically alter what is no longer working, to build a better, fairer system for all of us. Our loved ones were extremely vulnerable before the crisis, and now we recognize how vital our efforts have been. With no parole and minimal relief valves, we fight for a post-conviction board to look at these cases and to look at the sick and aging population as a result of sentencing guideline faults and failures and the conditions of prison. With the clemency process broken and unanimous decisions sitting on the governor's desk for years at a time, these people remain inside a death trap, and they're waiting to go home. The health and well-being of those who have served over 20 to 25 years living in the prison environment, and those over the age of 50, are deeply compromised by the poor medical system that we know is painfully flawed. The horrific food being served by correctional industries and the deprivation of access to self-care takes an enormous toll on the body. That's really all I have to say, and I really appreciate being able to say it. We are desperately in need of attention to our people inside this system that is compromising lives and basically scaring families and the community. So I appreciate very much.
Thank you for joining us. And our last community speaker will be J.M. Wong. J.M. is a community member, a healthcare worker, and part of the COVID-19 Mutual Aid Network.
Thank you for hosting this. So I want to build off of Nikita's point earlier and Cassandra's points that the health of our most vulnerable populations, a lot of whom are incarcerated right now, actually impact our collective health. And in this case, the health of rural communities where these facilities are located. From what we have heard from folks inside, DOC doesn't seem to have a transparent and safe mitigation plan. And current practice, what we're seeing is that folks who are suspected to be positive are being sent to various facilities. So we've heard of people being sent from Vancouver, Washington to Shelton and to Column Bay. And from what we know, the spirit behind the governor's shelter-in-place order or travel restrictions and social distancing, the point of all that is to reduce exposure and prevent transmission across populations. So DOC transferring individuals with symptoms back and forth between rural places appears to be contrary to these directives. First, it increases the risk of exposure among incarcerated populations. And furthermore, it increases the risk of exposure to rural communities who work in these facilities. And from what we know, the health infrastructure in these rural communities will be greatly overwhelmed by any kind of outbreak in these facilities. Our hospital systems in Seattle are already approaching being overwhelmed, and there's talk of emergency triage protocols. Any kind of ways that DOC, does not, any measures that DOC takes that doesn't prevent a public health outbreak is actually really inhuman. We think that existing DOC infrastructure is not compatible with this public health pandemic, and we need clear, transparent, safe, public health informed COVID-19 mitigation plans from DOC that keeps our communities safe. Thank you.
Thank you, JM. And last, we'll hear from one of the two attorneys who will be both available on the call to answer questions about the litigation. I failed to mention our organization, Columbia Legal Services. We are a civil legal aid organization that works with communities facing poverty and oppression. We use every legal tool available on their behalf, including legislative advocacy and systemic litigation. So we hear about the lawsuit being filed today from Nick Straley, Assistant Deputy Director of Advocacy for Columbia Legal Services.
Thank you very much, Janet. As you have heard, Columbia Legal Services filed suit late last night on behalf of everyone locked up in Washington's prisons. We are asking the Washington State Supreme Court to order Governor Inslee and the Washington State Department of Corrections to immediately begin reducing the number of people in prisons across the state to address the coronavirus crisis. So far, they have refused to do so. As you've already heard, if emergency measures are not implemented immediately, the coronavirus is likely to spread throughout our prisons, jails, and detention centers, resulting in serious illness and potentially many deaths. Coronavirus in our prisons endangers the lives of the people who work and live in them, but it also endangers the lives of everyone on the outside as well. When an outbreak occurs in one of our prisons, the system will quickly collapse, requiring sick patients to be transferred to local hospitals. Our case is based on the experiences of the people inside and the best and most up-to-date scientific research and public health expertise. 5 nationally recognized correctional experts, scientists, and medical professionals, including a former head of the Washington State Department of Corrections, have shared their knowledge and expertise with us and with the court. Each recommends the immediate reduction of the prison population as an essential step in fighting the coronavirus pandemic. You can find their testimonies posted on our website, and I recommend that you read them. All of the evidence we have presented to the court proves that Governor Inslee and the Department of Corrections public health experts throughout the United States all agree that releasing people from prison is an essential step in fighting the coronavirus. Life in prison is hard and difficult, but with a contagion like the coronavirus, it may also become a death sentence for an untold number of people. As we all know by now, COVID-19 is a virus that no human has ever encountered before. It is particularly dangerous to older people and people with serious medical conditions, including pregnant women. Unfortunately, many older people and people with serious medical needs are currently locked up in Washington's prisons. Immediate steps must be taken to protect them. And we have already witnessed in nursing homes right here in Washington what happens when the coronavirus gets into cramped living quarters like those our clients experience in prison. Many people are at risk from the coronavirus in prisons have stable home lives they can return to immediately. They can then do exactly what the rest of us are doing to keep ourselves and our families safe. Hunker down and wait for the pandemic to pass. There will be people who may need some help transitioning out of prison. The state must immediately begin providing support and assistance in finding stable, safe housing and access to quality medical care for those who may need it. The Department of Corrections already has an army of staff who supervise people on the street. These probation officers can quickly and easily be retasked from sending people back to prison to helping those people coming out of prison. Coordination with other state and local agencies, if properly resourced and done right, can find appropriate placements for everyone leaving prison. We would have liked to have had people who are currently living in prisons be available for this call, but because of existing prison protocols, that cannot happen. But we have provided the court with their testimony, and I recommend that you review those 14 declarations that we have posted on our website. They include testimony from Cheyenne Colvin, a 21-year-old pregnant woman who was just sent to prison on a low-level drug charge, even though she has already successfully completed a 2-year court-ordered drug treatment program. She is due to give birth in May. She is currently sitting in the unit where all newly arrived women start their journey through the Washington prison system. She is surrounded by newly arrived women all day long, women who may harbor the coronavirus but don't even know it. There are so many women in her unit that a woman must sleep on the floor of her cell, only inches away from the communal toilet. Terry Kill works in the kitchen at the prison in Monroe. He is concerned for himself and the other men he works with. They stand shoulder to shoulder for hours a day, preparing meals, washing dishes, and filling trays for the 350 men who come through the meal line for lunch and again for dinner. One cough or sneeze could infect hundreds of men. Terry also lives in a dormitory-like unit. His small cubicle holds 3 men. Each cubicle is separated from the other by a short partition. Terry can look into the next door cubicle by standing on his bed. He shares toilets, showers, sinks, an ice machine, and a microwave with many other men. He sleeps mere feet from the 2 other men in his cubicle. Terry and the other men on his unit cannot be isolated from one another because of the physical structure of the prison in which they are held. This is true in other prisons as well. It is these conditions that will allow the coronavirus to spread throughout prisons. In fact, the Department of Corrections is already quarantining people, closing off whole wings and cramming men into cells together. The prison at Shelton now has men sleeping on the floors of cells because the Department of Corrections has to cram people together to make way for quarantining. As JM noted, when the coronavirus enters the prisons, the poor prison medical systems will be quickly overwhelmed. Medical care in prison is poor and difficult to access even in the best of circumstances. Prisons simply don't have the staff or equipment to meet the coming crisis. They lack personal protective equipment, ventilators, and staff trained in how to use them. And because prisons will not be able to care for all of the people who will become sick, they will send patients to the community hospitals in the places where prisons are located. The vast majority of these places are in rural communities without significant existing healthcare resources. Port Angeles, Pasco, Canal, Walla Walla, Aberdeen. Each of these communities will already be overwhelmed with caring for people living in their communities. They will be unable to meet the additional staffing and equipment needs when the prisons send sick people to their hospitals' doors. Doctors and nurses are so concerned with this possibility that the Washington State Hospital Association has weighed in support of our lawsuit and are urging the governor to take immediate action to reduce the number of people in our prisons to protect the broader community-based healthcare system. The World Health Organization and public health experts throughout the United States all agree that releasing people from prisons is an essential step in fighting the coronavirus. This is truly a community fight. Because of how contagious this virus is, all of us are only as healthy as the most vulnerable among us. Unfortunately, Governor Inslee and the Department of Corrections have refused to act. We are left with no choice. We are asking the Washington State Supreme Court to rule on our case as quickly as possible and to order the state to do the right thing. We have no time to waste, and immediate action is required.
Thank you very much, Nick. So we'll turn now to the question portion of the press conference, and I'm starting to see some coming in on the chat, so thank you for that. So again, I'll be moderating those questions and directing them to specific people, trying to consolidate where there are common questions. So one of the questions is, what is actually happening? What steps are people hearing are being taken within the facilities? So I'd like to ask Nick Allen to speak to that first, and maybe we can also hear from folks who have family members and what they're hearing.
Yeah, so, I think there are potential attempts to take into account what has been said as, best practices with regards to social distancing and cleaning of facilities. But the reality is that prisons are not set up to do that. And that's one of the reasons why we are asking for the governor and the secretary of DOC to take immediate action to release people from prison, because you have to take into account that, as has been explained already, prisons are congregate environments, and you have people that are living in crowded facilities, always within a couple feet of each other. So you cannot reach the appropriate level of social distancing that's necessary to prevent spread of the coronavirus. And therefore, the recommendations that have been put forward by correctional health care experts that we've talked to, epidemiologists, says you need to release the population in order to begin to achieve those appropriate levels of social distancing, and also get those individuals who are most vulnerable to exposure to coronavirus outside of that environment, so that they can be in appropriate settings. Similarly with hygiene protocols, while you can clean showers 3 times a day, you can clean toilets and urinals 3 times a day, there is more than that that is needed. You can't clean it after every use. You can't be in a situation like most of us are in, where you can protect yourself almost at all times against spread of the virus. And so while we think there may be some measures that are at least being taken into consideration, those are not going to be effective. And that's why we're asking for measures to be taken that include the release of individuals into the community.
Thank you, Nick. Cassandra, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, the information that I have received from inside is that, much like Nick said, there is not the space to social distance in the way that we out here in the community are being asked to social distance. As such, they have increased some of the cleaning, but not to the level that it needs to be in order to prevent this virus from spreading. The reality is, the increase is now they're cleaning every couple of days. And that's just not an acceptable response. That's not preventative. It's not what the governor is recommending for any of the rest of us. They are not allowed to have hand sanitizer, things that we're being recommended to do all of the time. They don't have access to and aren't being allowed to do. And as such, punitive measures are being taken. So incarcerated folks are being told if they don't socially distance themselves, which is almost impossible inside of these institutions, that they will be locked down. Again, that's not the answer. You're locking people down in a cell that's also not 6 feet away from the person that they're incarcerated with, that they're in the cell with. So while DOC does seem to be having some kind of a response and a little bit of an increase in cleaning, it's not an acceptable response.
Thanks, Cassandra. We have some questions about what is happening with regard to other types of facilities. Nikita, has there been any difference in how juvenile facilities have been addressing the pandemic and taking steps compared to adult jails and prisons?
Yeah, so I'll speak first to the King County Youth Detention Center, or what some call the Children and Family Justice Center. Um, the steps that have been taken, I mean, obviously there's only about 41 youth in there a day. And so as a result, youth are being socially distanced. The issue here, though, is they're being prevented from seeing their families. They are also being put in a similar lockdown situation. So in many ways, this again is a punitive response against young people because of a pandemic that they have no control over. I think what's very relevant when we talk about something like the Youth Detention Center is it is a jail. So we're talking about young people being held pre-trial, as well as some youth that might be maybe are being held on very short sentences. So in my legal opinion, especially when it comes to pretrial folks, not that conviction should matter here. Uh, those young folks should just be released to the care of their families, where we know that their families and themselves can be responsible for protecting them. In regards to JRA is equally as opaque as the Department of Corrections is, but if you've ever been to a JRA facility, they're very much set up similarly in a group model. So young people are in very close proximity to each other. They're in very close proximity to the corrections officers. So there's similarly the struggle around keeping spaces sanitized and clean. And as Cassandra pointed to, folks that are incarcerated are not receiving the same supplies that we're being advised to use. They're not allowed to have hand sanitizer. And to be frank, for myself, anytime I walk in a building, I wash my hands and then I use hand sanitizer. Anytime I leave the building, I wash my hands, I put hand sanitizer on, and young people being held in JRA facilities are not given the same freedom or ability to protect themselves as those of us here in community are being advised to. So that would be my response. I would also recommend, if you want further information, contacting the director of the Department of Public Defense here in King County. I know that they've also been working on the issue as it relates to JRA and the Youth Detention Center.
Thank you, Nikita. We've got a few questions I'm going to direct to Nick Straley. One is with regard to whether we have gotten a response from the governor, Secretary Sinclair, and also what is happening with county jails.
So the response from the governor and Secretary Sinclair has been that they are looking at the issue, but they've made no decisions about whether they will agree to release anyone as an action in response to the coronavirus crisis. So at this time, they have not agreed to release anyone, no matter what their health situation might be as a result of this crisis. And I would add, there are many different types of mechanisms that are currently available for both the Department of Corrections and Governor Inslee to immediately begin releasing people into safe situations. The governor or Secretary Sinclair can use his furlough authority. He can use authority to release people in what's called graduated reentry, and he can release people into emergency medical placement. He can do that today without the need for any further action. Governor Inslee has the power to call the Clemency and Pardons Board into emergency session, to begin determining who is most appropriate for clemency and the circumstances in which they should be granted clemency. That can happen today. That can happen right now. In addition, Governor Inslee, under his emergency powers that he has invoked, has the ability to waive any state law, any state regulation, any state policy that limits or hinders his ability to respond to the current coronavirus epidemic, meaning that he can waive any limitation that the Department of Corrections has to reduce the prison population immediately today. We've asked the governor and we've asked Secretary Sinclair to utilize these tools to address the dire situation in our prisons, and to date they have refused. With respect to the question about jails, we have a vast number of jails in this state, all of which are run by different entities, different administrations, different cultures, different rules. Because of that disparate system, it's incredibly difficult to create a broad change across the state. We and many others, like Nikita and JM, have called upon jails across the state to begin reducing their population immediately. They have people coming in and out of their facilities every day. They have people coming straight from the streets. They mix with others. Coronavirus will get into the jails in Washington as it has in the facilities in New York. It is simply a matter of time. And again, jails are just as badly resourced as the prison system, have no way of dealing with the epidemic or providing appropriate medical care. They will be overwhelmed, and they will be bringing patients to the doors of the community hospitals in each of the communities in which they live or sit. Jails must immediately begin reducing their population. And so we have called upon judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement to work collaboratively to release as many people as we can, as quickly as we can.
Thank you, Nick. We have a question about the Supreme Court order that came out last week relating to virus. Took a couple of steps, including made some specific recommendations relating to people entering jails. And Nikita, I'll ask you to put on your lawyer hat and respond to what do you think about the adequacy of those steps from the state Supreme Court?
Yeah, I mean, I think the state Supreme Court made a good decision putting that out. Essentially, you know, there are a few ways that we can begin to decrease this public health and public safety threat of COVID in jails and prisons. One way is to actually release people and decrease the population in jails and prisons. The other way is to stop the flow of people from going in. And so I'll speak specifically to what I've experienced in King County, is that we have been very slow to respond to that order, whether it's around stopping the filing and prosecution of misdemeanors, whether it's around not requesting people to come to court. I mean, as of last week, in many ways, we were still requiring people to show up for first appearances and putting attorneys, community members, family members at risk. And so while I do think that that order is a good step in the right direction of moving courts, and especially courts and prosecuting attorneys' offices to see themselves as having a role in decreasing the spread of COVID-19 and actively not overcharging, actively not charging misdemeanors, actively not requesting for people to be detained, actively participating in motion, seeing people be released. King County has been very slow to actively do that, and many judges and prosecuting attorneys have actually stood in the way of seeing that happen. I'm sure other attorneys on this could probably speak more holistically to that as well.
Thanks, Nikita. So we have a question relating to the lawsuit and whether there is a priority as to who the suit seeks to release. And Nick Allen, if you could take that one, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. So I think what we're in the suit, what we're looking at is release based on what the science tells us. And so really thinking about three categories of individuals. First of all are folks who are older. So the suit asks for consideration of release first for people who are 50 years of age and older. Second is individuals who have serious underlying medical conditions that would put them at a particular risk of harm from COVID-19, and this has been, disseminated widely that both of these populations are at a particular risk should they become infected with COVID-19. And then the third category of folks is really based on the time that they have left on their sentence. So if folks don't fall into one of those first two categories, looking at release for individuals who have early release dates within the next 18 months, who are in prison or currently on work release. And some of the thinking behind that is that our understanding is that a vaccine may not be available for this virus for at least the next 12 to 18 months. And so those people would also, why put those people at an increased risk of harm as well? Take steps to reduce the prison population by getting those folks who are close to their release dates out. Again, to increase social distancing within the facilities and allow folks to get back into their communities and take advantage of all the practices that we are using in the community as well.
Thanks. And Nick Straley, did you want to add anything about what the lawsuit is requesting in terms of relief?
Yeah, so in addition to release, we're also asking that the Department of Corrections take immediate steps to ensure the health and safety of the people that will remain. One of the concerns is that they will not have appropriate protective, personal protective equipment, ventilators, other important medical equipment. So we're asking that the court order them to ensure that they have those facilities and that equipment and the trained staff available to assist when people will need it in the prisons. We're also asking for a variety of other remedies to address issues inside, including the ready access of alcohol-based hand sanitizers and soap and water. We're asking that they be provided free of charge to people inside. There have been individuals who have told us that they don't have access to hand sanitizer, and that's a serious concern. We're asking that they take particular care of people who are in serious medical care conditions. So, for example, we have a client who is an older man. He lives in the Stafford Creek Correctional Center in Aberdeen. He has early onset Parkinson's, which requires him to have a walker and other items to help him get around. Because of his Parkinson's, he has to use a catheter. His cell doesn't have a sink, a shower, or a toilet. The only facilities he can use are the communal facilities, the communal bathrooms, the communal toilets, the communal showers that 50 other men also use. If his unit goes into lockdown, he will be locked in his cell, having to figure out what to do to address his medical needs in a locked cell without access to water, without access to a toilet. These are the concerns that our clients are raising, and these are the legitimate concerns that people inside face. And until we start getting people out, there won't be a place for that client to go. There won't be an alternative cell where he can go, where will have access to water, where he will have access to appropriate hygiene. And that's why it's absolutely essential that there not only be answers inside the prisons, but that there be answers by removing people from the prisons.
Thank you, Nick. And one of the steps, of course, to address this pandemic is to get more testing and treatment for people when they're suspected of having been exposed. So, JM, could you speak to what the COVID Mutual Aid Network has been asking for, both with respect to steps to increase testing, like waiving copays? Is that happening? What are some of the other things that your group is asking for?
So a bunch of us on this call are part of COVID-19 Mutual Aid, and recently wrote 3 letters, one to the mayor, one to the governor and DOC, and then one more to Doc Constantine regarding the conditions of the jails and prisons. And one of our demands is free testing and waiving of medical copays. What we've been hearing from folks in DOC and what we've heard from King County Jail is people do have access to testing, but we don't know about the copay situation, if medical copay is being waived. I mean, folks may know that DOC is known for medical negligence. There was the recent case in Monroe where the director of health is under investigation for allegedly contributing to some of the deaths in the facility. So we just want to reiterate that, you know, DOC doesn't have a great track record of supporting the health of folks who are incarcerated. And so now there's no reason for us to have more confidence in that system.
Thank you, JM. I am not seeing questions in the queue, so I'll take the opportunity to let any of the panelists chime in with any information that they have on any of the questions that have been asked or anything that was sparked by this discussion.
I do want to make a point, is that what we're hearing from folks inside and also in the news is that there are folks incarcerated who are making the protective gowns. At Coyote Ridge, they converted the correctional industry factories into gown production factories. And it's really jarring for us to see that we're using prison labor to make these PPEs that folks inside do not have any access to. So that's really ridiculous for us. And then the other thing we're hearing is that even though all visits have been suspended, all non-essential activities have been suspended, but correctional industries is still running. Like non-PPE gown production, correctional industries factory, they're still running. So we're asking DOC, what are your priorities? What about the health of our folks inside and the communities that they're part of? We want that to be the priority rather than correctional industries.
And Janet, I just wanted to add to the question regarding the Supreme Court order, and thank you, JM, for bringing up the issues around correctional industries. That, as great as it is that the Washington State Supreme Court has taken steps to provide jurisdictions with some recommendations, those jurisdictions have a lot of autonomy and choice in how they do or do not follow those recommendations. And what is significant about this suit is really asking, in regards to DOC, asking the governor, or forcing the governor through the courts to have to take a concerted action that actually does release people and actually does decrease the number of incarcerated individuals being held in prisons, I think is significant. It's not enough to provide directives right now when we see counties like King County failing to actually take quick action in the midst of a global pandemic. We really need some pressure and some power that forces jurisdictions to have to respond and address this public health and public safety crisis that does affect all of our communities.
Thanks, Nikita. So I'll direct the next question to either Nick Allen or Nick Straley, whoever wants to chime in. The question is regarding the priority order of the release. Would it include consideration of the nature of the crimes for which the people were convicted? And a follow-up to that is what would happen to folks after they are released, and when the pandemic crisis is over, what happens to them?
And Nick, why don't I take the first one and you could take the second one? So with respect to the question of prioritization based on conviction, this pandemic doesn't make a distinction based on the crime. This pandemic attacks everyone. We don't think it's appropriate that those decisions be made based on what the conviction may be. Now, that being said, of course, there will be issues related to particular and unique circumstances. And of course, those should be considerations. But for the vast majority of people who we are talking about, they should be released. And in fact, the people we are talking about are generally the folks who are the least risk to the community. We're talking about people who are over 50. The statistics are proven that people over 50 rarely, if ever, reoffend. We're talking about people with serious medical conditions, which by themselves make it difficult to reoffend. And we're talking about people who are within 18 months of release, who are people who are currently eligible for various release options or minimum security. So the categories of people that we're talking about are already appropriate for release. And yes, on the margins, there may be a few instances where there might be questions, but the vast majority of people should be released into their communities so they can do exactly what we are all doing, which is sheltering in place and being with their loved ones.
Thank you. And a question for Nick Allen. The follow-up is the idea that people who would be released would remain out, or would some of them have to go back? I think Nick Straley addressed some of that, but Nick Allen, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, no, I agree with what Nick is saying. We have not contemplated that as part of the release request in the lawsuit. As he said, these are people who are older, with underlying medical conditions, and people who are close to release. And our opinion is that release decisions can be made so that these individuals are better served, better placed back in our communities, rather than being in a prison where there's not only the dangers of COVID-19, but just the harms of prisons themselves. And so we want to ensure that folks that are released are not faced with having to go back into the prisons. That's not what's contemplated with the request that we're asking for.
Great. And we've got a question that I'll just throw out to any of the panelists or anyone who has information about how pregnant women and babies in the RBP program are being protected.
As I mentioned, I've spoken with a woman who is currently pregnant at the women's facility at Purdy. And she has seen an OB one time in the month that she has been locked up. We don't have any information about how women in that program are in the program once she gets out of receiving, that she would potentially join, are being treated any differently. It may well be that they're being asked to do social distancing and that type of thing. But part of that program is geared toward socialization, and it's geared toward women working together to deal with the new parents that they have become. And so the type of things that we're talking about in terms of what are needed to do are antithetical to the goals of that program. And so there, again, it's another example of how this pandemic is affecting so many people in so many different parts of our lives. And indicates that a release is appropriate for women with babies in order they can take their children home and be safe with them at home.
Thank you. I think I've caught all the questions in the queue, but I'll give a few minutes for folks to catch up and compose thoughts. If they have other questions, please type them in the group chat.
Could I just add one thing, Janet? I just also wanted to point out that there are many, many men in the facilities we're talking about who have children at home. And there are many, many men who fall within the category of people that we're talking about. And those children need their dads. It's much more humane in this time of crisis to allow families to be together. And so from people in the categories talking about who are low risk and need to get home, it's absolutely essential that the state courts weigh in and order the governor and Secretary Sinclair to do the right thing.
And speaking to that need for family support and connection, Cassandra, you've spoken about that previously. I wonder if you have something you want to add on that note. Struggles with your family member and being able to be in touch with him as he has concerns about his family outside.
Yeah, I would just second what Nick Straley just said, and that it is absolutely the humane thing to do. Like I said before, my loved one is having to choose which family member he gets to check on each day, and not able to communicate with his kids all of the time. We are all also in a time of crisis out here, so we are all doing a lot of different things. So, he's out at various times, but only one time a day, and no real way to communicate when he might call so we can all be prepared to even answer. JPay communications are so slow right now because visitation has been completely cut off. It's taking a longer amount of time for a JPay message to get through, just a simple check-in. Being able to even log on and add money to the phones is becoming almost impossible. It takes took me almost an hour just to get onto the website to add money to the phone for him to be able to call anyone. So yeah, I would definitely second what Nick said. It is absolutely the right thing to do for folks in these categories to be allowed to come home to their families, to be allowed to shelter in place with their families in the same way that the rest of us are being asked to do and allowed to do.
Thank you, Cassandra. Last call for any questions or final comments from our panelists.
I want to say something, and I think this is coming from my perspective as a nurse. I've worked as a nurse in the local hospital for several years, and I don't know if people in DOC understand the magnitude of human suffering that they're contributing to when people from rural areas are being flown into Seattle. They're often alone. And with this COVID-19 situation, people are dying alone in the hospitals. People are dying without being able to get visitation from family. And we're gonna see an influx of people coming in from rural areas. And the fact that that's not even within the consideration of this institution that's so focused on punitive punishment, that's so inadaptable to this crisis, that's willing to put the lives of so many people on the line because they cannot adapt fast enough to really take this seriously as a crisis, is really shocking to me as a healthcare worker, as a community member. And we're gonna see the consequences of that in 2 weeks, in the month. And I mean, we're trying to do public health right now. This is not just about our communities inside, it's about our collective health. So yeah, I'm gonna end with that. Thank you.
Thanks, JM. And I wanted to lift up a comment that came through, I believe it's from community member, the stressful nature of living in prison, especially on lockdown, will exacerbate the course of the virus for anyone there who is there and contracts it. So I think that's right. And one last question that I'd love for anyone to speak to is about how organizations who support this effort, who are outside of Washington, can help, and whether there are other lawsuits in other states. I can take that last one, that there, to our knowledge, has not been a systems lawsuit like this one. There are individuals who are seeking to be released or not transferred into the custody of their prison systems. But the question of how can others support?
I mean, one thing I would recommend, Janet, is for people to get involved with some grassroots efforts. I don't think just this suit is the only way that we're going to achieve this. I think filing a lawsuit is a part of a diversity of tactics. And as JM pointed out, the COVID-19 Mutual Aid Coalition has put out a series of letters to the Department of Corrections and the governor, to King County, to the executive, and to the prosecuting attorney's office, and to the mayor of Seattle and the city of Seattle attorney's office. And so, you know, one way to access those letters and to sign on as an organization is to go to our Facebook page at COVID-19-Seattle, or COVID-19 Mutual Aid-Seattle, or to get onto the Instagram, which is also at COVID-19 Mutual Aid, and sign on to those letters, circulate them to organizations. The more we can build community pressure, the more effective this lawsuit becomes. And I think a diversity of tactics of expressing our commitment to our loved ones that are incarcerated, but also to the collective health of our community, like JM was noting, I think is essential. So it's not just about the lawsuit. This is one legal tool in our toolkit for advocacy, and there are many others, and the COVID-19 Mutual Aid Group is organizing community to be a part of that.
Thanks so much, Nikita. And in the chat, JM has put in the Instagram and Facebook links, I guess. Not sure what you call them. So look them up there if you are looking to join this effort and support the requests for relief. Handles, thank you. So thank you very much, folks. We are at an hour, which is the time that we had set for this press conference. Very much appreciate everyone who has joined us. I'm going to we'll leave the call up for a little bit so folks can make sure to capture the information in the group chat that they might want to grab. For Columbia Legal Services, if you have questions about our lawsuit, again, we will be posting shortly on our website, the actual pleadings and declarations from the petitioners and others who are inside, and some other folks who are weighing in to support the lawsuit. And yes, just wanted to uplift that we were able to hear from someone inside through a family member who says, thank you everyone working together to advance this cause. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll just leave this link open for a few minutes. Thanks very much, everyone. Thanks to our panelists.